That was Carlos Fuller, who is the Belizean ambassador to the United Nations, talking to me a little earlier. We're going to stay on the subject of climate change because research carried out this year by atmospheric scientists at the University of Reading in the UK shows that turbulence experienced by air passengers has been getting worse since the 1970s, and it's the warming of the air that's responsible. Let's talk to Paul Williams, Professor of Atmospheric Science at Reading University, who led the study. Professor Williams, thank you very much for joining us on Weekend. What prompted the research? Was it kind of curiosity about kind of anecdotal experiences discussed by colleagues? Remarks of passengers about bumpy journeys?
Yes, good morning, Shaun.
Good morning.
A combination, I think, of all of those. And it's not the most obvious impact of climate change, is it? Because we think about flooding, extreme heat waves, extreme weather, of course, all of that happening at ground level where we live. But the reality is that the climate is changing at 35,000 feet as well. And this has the potential to cause all sorts of problems for the future of flying, more lightning strikes, for example, and even at ground level at airports, hotter air, reducing takeoff weights and sea level rise flooding airports. So there's a whole host of possible impacts. But this thing about turbulence, which I've been studying for 20 years, it's really my specialty. A colleague knocked on my door 10 years ago and said, "Hey, Paul, what's climate change doing to turbulence when we fly?" And I had no idea, and no one had any idea. And so that was the beginning, really, of a decade-long portion of work for me to try and find out the answer.
And you've come up with some fairly dramatic statistics to support your argument.
Yes, we've crunched the numbers now in many studies, and we found that, for example, since 1979, which is when satellites first began observing the upper atmosphere, the jet stream has increased in wind shear by 15%, and that has caused 55% more severe turbulence over the North Atlantic and 41% more over the US, and similar statistics around the world, really. And then looking forward to the future, our projections are for a further 17 to 29% increase in the amount of wind shear in the jet stream. And that's going to cause a further 100 to 200% increase in the amount of severe turbulence. And by the way, severe turbulence, by definition, is turbulence that if you're not seatbelted, you will become a projectile essentially in the cabin. It's strong enough to lift you out of your seat if you're not seatbelted.
So it's not just a question of convenience when the stewards advise you to remain with your seatbelt fastened at all times when you're not moving around the cabin. Let me bring in our guests here, Alex and Owen. I wonder if either of you have a comment or a question on this, because you're both experienced flyers. For your sins, because you both have to, one to Greece, one to China. Alex?
I can't tell you what an enormous relief it is to hear Paul this morning, because I was genuinely sure this was all in my head, because I have noticed turbulence getting much, much worse, but then you don't fly enough. You're a sample of one. You think, I've just been unlucky. Paul, can I ask you something? Are there spots around Europe, for instance, where there is always bad turbulence? Because I seem to experience it always, for instance, flying over the Pyrenees or flying over the Alps. So are there hot spots of turbulence?
Yes, Alex, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. And in fact, you've identified the answer really in the question, because mountain ranges are hotspots. As the atmospheric winds blow over a mountain, the disruption to the airflow, the air is being forced upwards, generates a kind of wave. It's called a gravity wave. And that can, and indeed frequently does, break down into turbulence. So, yes, I remember flying into, Denver over the Rockies. Flying over or into a mountainous airport is always going to cause a few bumps, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And there are a few of those in China, aren't there? Mountainous airports.
Very much so. I'm actually interested because, of course, every time I go back to China, it's a much bigger airplane compared to in Europe. And I find the more turbulence when I just fly during Europe trips. Is there any difference? The size of the flight will cause any difference?
It absolutely does, Owen, and that's a great point as well. The general rule, although there are exceptions, of course, but in general, the bigger the plane, the less turbulence you will feel. And in fact, the injury rate is much higher on small private aircraft, and in fact, around 1/3 of turbulence-related accidents on small private planes actually do result in at least one fatality.
Wow.
But on large commercial aircraft, it's much rarer, and the larger the plane, the better. So if you're a nervous flyer, and actually that's a diagnosable condition to psychiatrists, it's called aviophobia, and 20-25% of us may have this. You really want to be on a large aircraft, a 787 or an A380, just to keep those bumps to a minimum.
Paul, can I ask you one quick final question? When you're talking about turbulence, what about ways that we might minimise the risk to ourselves, the discomfort of the journey? You talked about booking on a larger plane. Is it true that the cheaper seats at the back tend to have a rougher ride, or is that just a myth?
I think that is true. So you can control that if you can, and try and sit near the front. Of course, that costs you a bit more money to buy your ticket. I mean, I think general advice is to focus on the things that you can control. Of course, lots of people will be flying today and in the coming days to visit their loved ones for the holidays. And indeed, some people might be on their way to the airport right now as they listen to this discussion. So not wanting to worry anyone. You're not in the cockpit. You can't steer the plane, but you can fasten your seatbelt. And you should. You can put on some headphones and listen to some nice relaxing music. You can slow your breathing and take some deep breaths. And I'm not a psychologist, but I find that these simple measures really can make a difference.
Professor Paul Williams. Paul, are you travelling this Christmas, or are you keeping your feet firmly on the ground?
I'm not travelling. I was in COP, actually, going back to your previous item a couple of weeks ago. So I've done my flying, and I'm staying put now for the next few weeks.
Well, whatever you do over this festive period, have a great one. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning here on Weekend. That's Professor Paul Williams, Professor of Atmospheric Science at Reading University, who led that fascinating study. You are listening to Weekend with me, ShaunLey.